When asked about the title for this talk, the words that came to mind, I know it's a little hokey, but I really believe these things are important, and there's some of the big lessons around the Kiva journey, connectedness, equity, and joy, and I'm just going to be covering some of those topics. So let me just dive right in here. I saw this on Facebook a couple of months ago, and I was like, oh, I'm going to be doing a talk in sustainability, and I love the definition around this notion of global well-being intergenerationally. That's what sustainability means, because it's very human-centered, and it's very inclusive, and it thinks about those who don't have voice in our current time, as well as people who aren't yet born. And I love the definition. And this scientist here wrote something, and it really just kind of, I think it's a problem that we all kind of think about, and I'm just going to read this. I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystems collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that. And I want to come back to this. So my story was raised in Minnesota. This is a Google image of suburbs, and it kind of looked like this. And I was really privileged to, be born to two parents who were both engineers. My brother, sister, and I had access to, all the kind of the real inputs you would need to thrive as kids. And I was also really privileged because my family is from India, and I got to go back to India to visit my grandparents. And so my first trip when I was 5 years old, just to learn a little more about me, I was in India, and it's such a rich culture. My mom, I had no idea she knew how to ride a moped. That was super cool. I got to eat ice cream every day. It was the best. And I was walking through a market. It was rainy season. I was walking through a market holding my mom's hand, and my mom had given me a 1 paisa coin, which is not worth very much. And this is another Google image. It's not this market, but basically, as I was walking through it, people are calling out to us. There's cows walking through the market, and it's like sensory overload, and it's wonderful. But I had dropped that 1 paisa coin. And my mom, not wanting her 5-year-old son to get his hands dirty, just said, kind of pulled me to keep walking. And I will always remember a woman in a ragged sari who was older than my mom. She must have been a beggar in that market. She, walked over, picked up the coin, tucked it in her sari blouse, and prayed, and was thankful for it. And so something that my mom's willing to throw away, or I could answer someone else's prayers. As a 5-year-old, it was an experience like that, as well as so many experiences, like getting right off the plane into the Mumbai airport and seeing kids your age knock on the window, looking for donations, or that is just so confusing. And I didn't have the language for it as a 5-year-old, but it shamed my moral sense, or you just kind of immediately know that something's not right. And that was a real awakening for me. And I don't think I'd be here had it not been for the incredible privilege of being able to travel back to India with my parents and just kind of witness the conditions that so many people live in, and really this notion of the birth lottery, where you're born determines so much of the opportunities you have. So since I'm back on campus, I thought, and many of you are, how many of you guys are undergrads here? All right. And is everyone else then generally probably, no one's probably in high school, so good. So speaking to you, what year are you?
I'm a senior.
Okay, you're a senior. Okay, my story here starts at the age of 20. And I think there's a few people here in your 20s. And what I did is I just plotted out my life from 20 to 30 on an axis of meaningfulness. And one of the reason why is because I used to go, do they still have a series at Stanford called What Matters to Me and Why? Yeah, that's still happening. I graduated in 98, so that's great. It was 20 years later. Go to those things. I thought those were so amazing. And I used to just walk around my senior year, because I had spring quarter off, because I graduated early. And I was asking, what's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of life? And I'd go to like famous professors' office hours. I would like go to these what matters to me and why things. Like, and I thought, why not ask like the most important question? And then one of the best responses was a professor who said, you're asking the wrong question. Don't ask what makes, don't ask what the meaning of life is. Ask what makes your life meaningful. And so that's kind of been a guiding question. And starting with sophomore year, I was living in Cedro. It was raining a lot. I was in the middle of sophomore slump. I had to pick a major. I picked economics. And thankfully, Professor David Abernathy, who I don't think is he still teaching here? Yeah, you know him? Okay, great. Changed my life forever. Introduced me to this notion of microfinance. How many of you guys have heard of microfinance? All right, sweet. So I heard about this, and I heard about market-based approaches to poverty alleviation, about Muhammad Yunus, who 10 years later would go on to win a Nobel Peace Prize for his work in microcredit and microfinance. And it just felt like a really hopeful, bottoms-up approach to some of the things that I witnessed on my trips back to India, and like maybe addressing poverty in a new, fresh way. So they gave undergraduate research grants, and I got one, and I went to the Self-Employed Women's Association as a senior, and did a small project on microinsurance, not microcredit, and it was the highlight for me of being at Stanford, my academic career, and I felt super alive, and things felt really meaningful. And then, of course, that plummeted when I went into management consulting. It's not that there's anything wrong with management consulting. It's just I felt like I felt very abstracted away from actually making an impact. I'd be making slides. I mean, good thing is I probably learned how to make really nice looking slides. Bad thing is that I just felt like I was doing things, and I was really disconnected to whether or not the client would actually implement anything. But great place to learn a lot of skills. And then a friend of mine in my freshman dorm at Donner is one of the co-founders of PayPal. And they were about 50 employees. They had just switched over from sending money from Palm Pilot to email-based payments. And he's like, come join us. There's a lot of work to do. And so I moved from New York as a management consultant back out to Palo Alto. I was right here on University Avenue. Super just lucky, stumbled into it because I was his friend. And what an education that was. For 6 years, sleeping bag by my desk type thing, worked all the time, but was really excited to really just as a product manager, build projects with engineers and designers and QA, and then actually have real people use something and provide feedback around why it sucked or why it was good. And then, I was only 23, 24, and I think it's one of the most amazing things to be able to put something out into the world and get feedback. And I learned so much around how transformative technology can be. PayPal was most useful at the time on eBay because it allowed you to safely buy, a computer from a stranger. And what was amazing to me is by the time I left PayPal, every 12 seconds, a car was bought on eBay from a complete stranger. And if you think back 20, 30 years ago, buying a car from a stranger, who doesn't live in your town would be insane. And PayPal and eBay enabled people kind of across borders to trade with one another, because they, created a kind of a trust platform and enabled all this opportunity. And kind of putting kind of the previous experience of microfinance with this kind of at that time, current experience of e-commerce, I was wondering, well, if you can buy from a complete stranger, why can't you invest in a complete stranger across wealth and geographic divides? And so I asked for a sabbatical. I went to India, and I was volunteering with a women's artisans groups, helping them by day list items up on eBay to see if we could kind of gain more revenues for their silk work, and then also testing the idea of could you make a loan to a woman. So this is on eBay. So you'd hit buy it now. This is back in early 2005, and you'd hit buy it now. pay me $100, it'd come into my PayPal account. I was in Ahmedabad, India. Ahmedabad's the 10th largest city. I'd pull money out of an ATM using my PayPal ATM card in Indian rupees, give it to her, and then even my sabbatical was only 2 months long, so if this were like a 1-year loan, a friend of mine would just collect money at 0 interest from her and then send it back to my PayPal account, and then I'd send it back to the person who hit buy it now. Does that make sense? I'll get into more of the details here, but that was like the concept, like person-to-person microcredit, and like, why not? Like, we should be able to do that, and if she pays back, oh my God, that'd be super exciting. So anyways, this whole thing got taken down by eBay's lawyers because it's illegal to use the eBay website to do cross-border international finance. I guess it violates a bunch of laws, and they had no idea I was an employee of eBay Inc. because, you know, I had this anonymous handle like SalsaBoy20. But the big thing was like, it was this like, you know, idea that needed to exist, and luckily there's a few other people when I came back to Palo Alto that were working on something very similar. Jessica Jackley, Matt Flannery, Chelsea Bacci. It was a small group of people who were looking at a similar idea. And we, you know, at first we were like trying to compete, and we were like, wait, why are we trying to compete? This is so hard. And then we just came together and started to get Kiva off the ground. And so this is a screenshot of a loan in Gujarat, India, not too far away from Ahmedabad. And let me just explain the process of how Kiva works. So how many of you guys have been to the Kiva website? Great. So let me just whip through this. So this is Royla Khan. She's a farmer in Kyrgyzstan. She wants to buy 2 cows so that she can get more profit, right? The challenge for her is that she doesn't have the initial money to buy those 2 cows. So banks won't lend to people like her because she doesn't have a credit score. It's just not profitable for a bank to make such small dollar loans. So in comes microfinance NGOs like the Grameen Bank that co-won the Nobel Peace Prize, Muhammad Yunus, but there's over 3,000 of these microfinance organizations around the planet. And they will lend to people like her. Now, where do these microfinance NGOs and banks, where do they get their money from? This is where crowdfunding can have a role, especially, here's the conceptual framework. If microfinance institutions work at the edges of banking where banks fail, then Kiva wants to work at the edge of microfinance where microfinance still fails. Does that make sense? In crowdfunding, in philanthropic crowdfunding, zero interest lending that we can do can basically help prove the business case where none existed before, to basically allow the markets to work better for folks who can't get access to loans today. So let me just make this a little more concrete. That microfinance bank in Kyrgyzstan will take her photo and her story, and it's like a crowdfunding website. And you know, you can see a loan of $1,850 helps Royla Khan buy cows for fattening and resale. And then you can come in kind of like on Amazon and like lend $25 or more. And basically, once it's fully funded by, you know, the thermometer hits 100% and a bunch of people have like crowdfunded it, then we collect that money, and we basically, it comes from the internet lenders to Kiva's website. Kiva's a 100-person nonprofit organization based in San Francisco. We send wires to over 400 of these kinds of organizations in 80 countries every month. They basically are responsible for administering the loan to Royla Khan. And so that's the value chain in the Kiva system. All right. Then the cool thing is unlike a typical donation, was Royla Khan pays back her loan to this group in Kyrgyzstan. This group sends money back to Kiva, and Kiva software sends it back to, like, for example, these 9 people. And if Royla Khan defaults on her loan, if she say you lend $100 and she only pays back 50% of her loan, you only get 50% of your money back. So this microfinance NGO doesn't take on the risk of Royla Khan defaulting. We all do, which then basically gets this microfinance NGO to try things that they might not have tried because of perceived risk or cost. And we're lending at 0 interest. And so they're getting it at 0 interest. They're marking it up with an interest rate to cover their costs. Is that how the money works? All right, sweet. So then let's say you get repaid, then the money comes back to your Kiva account. This is my Kiva account. You can see I have like $1,100 outstanding. I have about $170 in my Kiva credit that I can turn around and relend or withdraw back to my bank account. And then I've made loans to Lakshmi in India, Cosmos in Kenya, Maria in El Salvador. Basically, you can kind of get a sense of the people, the entrepreneurs all around the world that I've been, I guess, an investor in and whose dreams I backed. And yeah, so this kind of just shows you, and then most people choose to relend. About 7% of people choose to withdraw their money back to their bank account. So for the most part, the money just stays in the system and recycles over and over and over. And it's like you're recycling your donation to help several people over the life of until unless you lose it in a default. All right, so I'm just going to show how Kiva's grown. I'm going to play this quick 3-minute video.
One spark can change the world, no matter who you are or where you're from. The year is 2005, and Elizabeth, a widow and mother in Uganda, needs a loan to grow her business. Each of these green sparks of light represent a $25 loan from Sandra and 4 other people who believe in Elizabeth. Sandra is among the first lenders to back someone's dream on Kiva.org, and Elizabeth is one of the first borrowers to successfully repay the people who believed in her. Watch along as more people become Kiva lenders, backing the dreams of borrowers around the world. This animation shows 10 years of Kiva's lending activity and impact. In 2006, Kiva ignites into a global phenomenon. With more than 2 billion people around the world living in poverty, lenders embrace the chance to spark change. Roughly 75% of Kiva loans are to women. Women such as Isadora in Bolivia are more likely to use their income to grow their businesses, increase crops, and send their kids to school. Her loan was crowdfunded by 45 lenders, people including Deborah in California. After Deborah was repaid, she relent the same $25 to another borrower, like Gina in the Philippines. By the end of 2009, more than $100 million in loans are funded, and Kiva continues to crowdfund innovation by pushing the boundaries of financial inclusion. Education loans marked in yellow help students, including Miriam in Kyrgyzstan, finance her education, vastly increasing her lifetime earning potential. Her dream was backed by 41 people like you. By 2012, lenders have funded thousands of loans in conflict-affected regions to people such as Amadou in Mali, where access to capital is key to rebuilding. Alice in Uganda and other borrowers are able to take out green loans through Kiva. And by 2013, lenders have funded thousands of green loans for organic agriculture, clean cook stoves, and solar lights. Kiva is both a global and local phenomenon. Watch as people in the US, Kenya, and Mongolia lend to others in their own communities. And after 10 years with the help from hundreds of field partners, these 1.8 million borrowers in over 80 countries have a repayment rate of 97%, allowing 1.4 million people like you to relend that money again and again. And all of this change is being made one person, one loan at a time. It's been 10 years, and Kiva is still all about supporting each other as a connected global family. By working together, each of us can be the spark that changes the world. At Kiva.org.
So that was our promotional video. Thank you. I know it's an educational institution where I'm not trying to ask for donations or anything, but I think it gives you a sense of the scale. And what people usually get really excited about is just it's really these are real data points. This isn't it's the underlying data set is real of real people connecting with real people. So we made that video right when we turned 10. We're about 12 years old now. Let's see here. Please.
Many of these countries are very corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you had to deal with?
Yes. The question was around corruption. And not only are many of yes, there's corruption at all levels of all countries, including ours, of course. But we do work in environments that because of the levels of poverty. The idea of lending and getting the money back was really challenging in the beginning. So the first 10 field partners, we call them field partners, the microfinance banks that we work with, we call them field partners. Of the first 10, we found out basically about 8 of them we've had to close down. And the way we check for fraud is basically we do random sampling. So we have over 800 volunteer Kiva fellows that have come through the system, and for 4 to 6 months they'll be on the ground in a particular country, and they'll take a sample of, say, 10 or 20 small businesses that have been posted on the Kiva website, say in Cameroon, and they'll go visit them, and they'll go verify that all the data that's up on the website actually matches reality. And when we catch that it doesn't, we try to understand, is there a misunderstanding, or, is this part of a larger pattern? And, where we find a larger pattern, we then have to shut down that partnership. And the nice thing that we try to do is not give too much money to any organization too quickly until they go through all of these different checks. So there's upfront due diligence on these microfinance field partners, as well as ongoing monitoring, like auditing, like random sampling and checking. It's funny, like in San Francisco, we're a nonprofit, you think, like I just showed you a hopeful video, but it's such a cynical bunch. And it's because so much of our job is to keep out those who violate the trust of the system in order to allow a lot of the good to flourish. Does that make sense? Now, the nice thing about a loan model is that you catch pretty quickly if something's going wrong, versus a one-way donation model. There's not that same feedback loop around, is there some kind of graft or malfeasance or fraud? Does that make sense? Cool. I'm going to keep going, and then maybe, does anyone have any questions on the basic Kiva model? Otherwise, let me get back to our scientists here at Gus. And I think this is like a really hard problem. Like, what is there, like technical problems and then human problems? And like technical problems are solvable. I think that's what he's talking about. But the human problems, like things that require behavioral change, is really, really hard. And this reminded me of, how many of you guys have heard of Peter Singer? Peter Singer is one of our time's great moral philosophers. He's based in Princeton. He's credited with founding PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and he thinks very deeply around what we ought to do morally. And a thought experiment that he has is, if you buy a brand new car, since you spent $30,000, you've been working really hard, and you bought this, car, and you drive it off the lot, and you're super proud to own it, and then you're crossing a railroad track, and your car stalls. And you look left, and you see a train coming. And you look right, and you see an 8-year-old child tied to the track. And you have time to do just one of two things. Either get out and push your car out of the way and save your car, or untie the child and save the child. What do you think most Americans say they would do?
Save the child.
Save the child, right? And so then he says, well, look, every day, you have 19,000 preventable child deaths around the world, and there's all this kind of preventable suffering. Why do we let that happen? Why do we consume more than we really need? Why aren't we sharing more? Back to Gus's points around selfishness, greed, and apathy. Why? And so has anyone here actually listened to Peter Singer about this? This question, when I first heard it many, many years ago, actually before Kiva, has always just been something I just couldn't square. I was like, why is that? And then, you talk to folks and they go, well, it's actually for several reasons. One is, practically, it's not like the child is like right next to you. In this case, it's in your sphere of concern, right? In Peter Singer's a thought experiment. But, children are like really far away. They're not in your sphere of concern. Two, maybe like you don't feel like what you can do is going to be that effective, and so on and so forth. And so like the human mind just kind of like doesn't engage. And so therefore we go back to, what's in our sphere of concern. And sometimes those things might not be as effective in terms of like doing good in the world with the resources we have as Peter would like us to be. So the other thing, how many of you guys have heard that quote? I think there's different versions. There's Mother Teresa's version and there's Stalin's version, but it's this notion of like a single death is a tragedy, and then many deaths is a statistic. And this notion of, it's grim, but this is what we're, this is real, right? Like, there are, and this graph, since we're at Stanford, just kind of shows that the value of life saving seems to go down. There's like empirical evidence. The more populous it becomes. And so if you can kind of focus on one person, people get really excited. But then as you actually add more and more people and the group becomes bigger, it's called like cognitive collapse or compassion fatigue. All of a sudden we just don't want to engage. So 3 lessons from the Kiva journey that I wanted to share, because many of you guys are on your own leadership journeys around making change in the world, and it may be in a different area than poverty alleviation. But I just wanted to share some of the things that I thought were really important, and also just how hard it is for us to get this stuff right. And like, it's not been easy, and we're like highly imperfect, but we keep trying to do, try to do some good. So hopefully after I run through this, we can just have an open conversation. So first is the value of connectedness. And I really believe that abstraction, which is kind of like this superpower that we have, might be our undoing as a species and as really a planet. Abstraction, and by the way, technology just actually further abstracts us. It abstracts us from the food, like where our food actually was grown and the impacts of that. Like we just get it in a plate in a cafeteria here at Stanford. Like we're so abstracted away from so many things now. And like the opposite of abstraction, proximity, being close, concrete, connectedness, that is at the heart of what actually shifts us from selfishness to, I think, altruistic. Basically anything that kind of creates a wider sense of us and a smaller sense of them, I'm for. And I have seen time and again how the more we can make our website really connected, just like that experience I had when I was in India, the more we can do that, like the more generous people are. And it's really exciting. And I'm just going to walk through an example. This is Howard Zugman. Howard is just a lovely human being. He's a retiree. This is him with his grandchild, and he sings at area nursing homes here in the Bay Area, and he's been doing it. He's been with Kiva for almost 11 years, and every time he sings at an area nursing home, he gets paid a little bit, and he puts all of that into Kiva. And this is his Kiva lender profile. He's a retired sales engineer. And you can see that he's made now 17,500 loans on the Kiva website to people all over the world. And part of what he likes so much about it is essentially kind of the short, quick feedback loops of hearing back, as well as the simplicity and the personal connection. And Howard's not alone. There's so many people like him who basically went by taking the friction out and allowing it to be personally connected. It becomes really engaging. But one of the things that was a real surprise to us is in like 2009, we launched this concept called lending teams. And lending teams are like Facebook groups. So, on Facebook you can join, like, I don't know, I'm from Minnesota, the Minnesota Vikings group, because I'm a big Minnesota Vikings fan. Howard has joined, there's like 30,000 lending teams, affinity groups on Kiva. So he's joined like Becky's Hugs, which is a memorial team, or the Atheist team, which at the time of the screenshot had 800,000 loans. By the way, the top 2 teams on the Kiva website are atheists and Christians, and they kind of battle back and forth for the top. That could be like a real interesting paper right there. And there's like trash talking between them on that. It's wonderful. And he's basically, not only are there feedback loops between him and the person he's investing in, say in Haiti, but also there's this community of other people who like he feels like affinity and connection and friendship with, and together, instead of feeling like his $25 is never going to make a difference, he, together with like this, it's not even a crowd, it's a community of people that he shares affinity with, are getting things done. And like that can really be compelling. I've searched for the word addictive on these message boards, and you won't believe how many reports come back or results come back. So that's just really exciting, and I don't know what that means for other movements like within, say, the environmental sustainability movement, but part of the thing I've been thinking about recently a lot is around the plastics issue. And what might we do to create short, meaningful feedback loops and help make it more concrete so that we connect with all these things that the trails we leave behind, essentially. How can we connect with the actual negative impact or negative externalities, and how do we internalize that? And that's just something, I don't know, I just want to say I think it's really important. We want to do way more of that at Kiva. Another thing we do is, I mentioned we have this Kiva Fellows program. Over 800 people have come and volunteered for 4 to 6 months. Sometimes it's like a mini Peace Corps program. Yeah, you apply. We train you in San Francisco. We have 3 classes a year. This is Anya. She went to Pakistan. And there is just, again, something around proximity. Your heart goes where your feet are. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Brian Stevenson, who just talks about the value of proximity. And once you're proximate, you can't not forget. It then becomes a part of your narrative, and then that oftentimes is one of the best ways to shift versus listening to someone like me talk, right? So just getting out there and traveling, and we're trying to figure out how might we use Kiva, and what could we do to get people to actually travel, to be, to feel it for themselves, and that's something that we're trying to take the friction out of. All right, so if connectedness underlies why Kiva has grown, let me talk a little bit about equity. I don't know how many of you all know this, but when Kiva started, and when I learned about microcredit, microfinance here at Stanford in 1996, microfinance was awesome. Everyone was so excited about it. Muhammad Yunus wins the Nobel Peace Prize. Then, in 2009, 2010, microfinance, a lot of new evidence came to light. And this complicated graph here is a summary of a bunch of randomized control trials. Do you guys know what RCTs are? A randomized control trial, that's how drug development happens, where you have a treatment group and a control group, and then you see the effect of the intervention to see, was there any effect? And basically, the long and short of it is that microcredit isn't as impactful as we thought it was. And here we are, the retail public brand of microcredit, oversimplifying the connection, getting all these people all riled up, and the actual impact evidence. Yeah, credit access goes up, but actual income, negligible effect. That's terrible. I mean, here we are, people are feeling good about the impact they're making, and then we actually have evidence that that points to the fact that, oh my God, should we shut down Kiva? Because maybe you could actually give it to things that are actually of higher impact. So it wasn't practical to shut down Kiva. I don't think that would have been the right moral thing if we didn't believe we could change towards higher evidence-backed outcome, or interventions that have higher evidence, an evidence base for, oh my God, what's going on with me? If we couldn't shift Kiva to things where there's a high confidence level around the actual impact on the ground. And so let me just walk through some of the things that we're doing. This was one of the most painful moments for me of the Kiva journey, because I was like, oh gosh, what are we doing? And maybe this is super inside baseball, but for those of you on your leadership journey of trying to actually make change in the world, I think kind of the meta lesson here is that it's not this rosy thing and the map explodes and it's all good. Inside, there's been so much turmoil and so many questions around wait, what is the real impact we're making? How do we shift when we learn that something is not as good as we thought? And we got to be transparent with the public on this whole thing. So it's been a real tough slog. But here we are. This is 2010. We're 8 years later. I can say that 63% of the loans on our website that are featured now have an evidence-backed attribute around positive outcomes. So we're not 100%, right? So I can't say 100% of the loans we have high confidence that it's really creating meaningful impact. But that started at one point we had nothing. Or at least no real rigorous data, and we've been working year after year of trying to actually work now less with microfinance institutions and more with evidence-backed social enterprises, nonprofits and for-profits, where there's clear evidence that that low-income person who's borrowing the money on Kiva is actually going to be making more money than they're paying for the cost of capital, because the interest rates in these things are high. And so we want to make sure that the return on capital for that low-income household exceeds the cost of capital. All right, so let me just give you some clear examples These are really exciting. This group right here raised $1,000, and what's really interesting, this is super small. The repayment term is 122 months. That's 10 years from now. Why is it a 10-year loan? Because basically you're paying for seedlings, fertilizers, a number of inputs to allow these two dryland farmers to get each on each of their land. They're in eastern Kenya, and land fertility is really low. It's really arid. The ability to plant 200 trees each, and if these trees can survive 7 years, each tree can be harvested for about $30. Kenya is a net importer of lumber, and sold for $30. If you harvest it after 10 years, wait 3 more years, and it really thickens, it can become like a light pole, which you could sell for about $100. This group, Komaza, right here, is a social enterprise in Kenya. They basically provide these seedlings and train the farmers on how to take care of the trees, and then they do a 50-50 revenue split once they're harvested and sold at the mill. And when we funded them, they're in what's called the Pioneer Grant. They were supported by philanthropy, but they're post-grant and pre-commercial. Yet local banks, impact investors, venture capitalists, all these guys still felt it was too risky because there was no harvest data yet, because it takes 7 to 10 years to actually get any real meaningful harvest data. And a lot of things can go wrong with these trees. There could be pests, a drought. The farmers could side sell. It was an unproven model of microforestry. But why it's so exciting is if you look at the economics for these farmers, right? You just kind of multiply it through. For these dryland farmers who, in their area, they're earning about 50 cents a day. That's purchasing power adjusted. So it's like actually having 50 cents to live on here, right? I mean, this is really, really poor folks. This kind of windfall, if it works per farmer, would bring them into the middle class of Kenya. And so it's super exciting. Yet these models, like, they kind of starve because there's not enough philanthropy to scale microforestry. You need a lot of capital to like get that going. Right now they have 1.5 million trees in the ground with 5,000 farmers. And they're really struggling to get like commercial capital or impact capital, or like real scale-up capital, because they haven't de-risked or proven the viability of this thing. And so this is where crowdfunding can come in and fill a gap between donations and investments. Does that make sense? And if we do, then we prove the business case ultimately to commercial capital, and they can scale up microforestry. And dryland farmers, if you look at the poorest 1 billion people on the planet, the vast majority of them make their living in agriculture. And if you look at the poorest of those, dryland farmers are in that set. So this could be really powerful. Anyways, I was in Lebanon. This story really moved me. Right now, 1 in 4 people are refugees in Lebanon. The Syrian refugee crisis is something that's felt every single day in that country, and there's a lot of tension between the host population and the host Lebanese as well, and the Syrians. There's a perception of wage competition, so on and so forth, and it's a really challenging situation. And because of the kind of, imagine if something changed so suddenly here in the United States, you would imagine there was probably a lot of animosity. There is already animosity. And so, politicians are kind of, it's a really challenging situation. And this is a really unique loan product where our partner, Al Majmua, basically will form groups of Syrians and Lebanese, and they come together and they borrow together and they get a lower priced loan if they come together. And in doing so, they basically, the Syrians who just migrated there, they're seen as flight risks, and so they can't qualify for loans. But if they're neighbors with the Lebanese, they come together, the neighbors know them, it's solidarity group borrowing, and they guarantee each other's loans. And what's really exciting is that as these people come together and they get lower priced loans together, that's crowdfunded, there's real social cohesion that starts to form, and friendships and kind of neighborly support. And we start reframing the other, like a larger sense of us. And so I'm just really excited about this. This is right at the beginning, but now we're taking this to Jordan. We just started a pilot there, and we'd like to do this in more more places where, when we think about refugees, we have to think about, humanitarian assistance is important, but we also have to design for a post-humanitarian response, and something that looks at long-term livelihoods. And something like this could be really powerful, especially if the repayment rates become high. Then you can imagine it's not just this group that does it, but all the banks in the market start lending to Syrians. And that would be, capital access is so important in these economies for small businesses to take hold, because most of the way people make a living is in the informal sector, like through microenterprise. All right. I'll just whiz through this. This is a small medium enterprise in Iraq. Obviously, don't need to get into why others might be kind of fearful of lending there. In Palestine, where you have really high youth unemployment, we have a program on youth livelihoods. This is in Nepal. This is solar energy for a hospital clinic for possible health out there. This is a microgrid in Haiti that we've crowdfinanced. Has anyone ever seen a biodigester before? I think these are amazing. Yeah, some nods here. So think of it as like a bouncy castle of poop. What goes in here is manure. What comes out is fuel for the home and fertilizer. And basically, if you look at two big costs for a farmer, it's fuel and fertilizer. And so now the farmer, this is a real sustainable solution. It's a total win for all. If the farmer can afford, this unit was $525. 17 people crowdfunded it, made it affordable for her to then pay back in installments over time, and she's basically saving on fuel and fertilizer cost. And I just think that more of this. In fact, Kiva lenders funded this group, Sistema Biobolsa, in Mexico, and now they're in 5 countries. And so it's a way of scaling these market-based approaches that can be a real win for all with environmental benefits. All right, so what about here in the US? People are surprised to know that we work here, and just right here in the Bay Area, I just want to walk through an example. This is Victor. Victor, back in 2011, was opening up a coffee shop. He couldn't qualify for a loan because they didn't have credit score and cash flows. Like 70% of small businesses here in the US that apply for a bank loan get rejected. You need 3 years of cash flows typically, like documented cash flows, and then you need a 620 FICO score. And if you don't have those things, you can't get money. And if you can't get money, it's hard to make money as an entrepreneur. And so what's really cool is he went to the Mission Economic Development Agency in the Mission District of San Francisco, went through business training. His instructor really got to know his character, really believed in him, and vouched for him. We then basically put his loan up on the website. He raised $5,000 at 0 interest back in 2011, and he paid back via PayPal over 12 months. And if he pays back that first loan, then he qualifies for a second loan. Okay, so that's how it works. Well, so check this out. That's back in 2011. So he pays back this loan. I crowdfunded him. A bunch of other people did. He pays it back. Then in 2013, you can see that he gets a 36-month loan of $10,000, and this is now for a second coffee shop, which is pretty killer, right? So he's doing well. Not all entrepreneurs are, do as well as Victor, but he really is a success story. Why? Because not only is he actually killing it in the coffee business in San Francisco, but he turns around and he pays it forward. So this is Rocio. She would bring this vacuum cleaner on the Muni bus in San Francisco in between dropping her kids off at school, picking them up after work. She's missing client appointments. So if she could get a car, she wanted to buy a used minivan, she needed $3,000, but she didn't have the credit score to get it. She's basically losing revenue. But Victor, who goes to church with Rocio, because he's paying back on the credit on the Kiva website, he establishes a trustworthiness score, so he can then vouch for her. Right? So then Eva gets this loan. Eva then has now paid back this loan. She got another loan for $10,000. She's now employing 3 people, which is awesome. So this is back in 2012. As Eva pays back that loan, she vouches for Rocio. As Rocio paid back that loan, she vouches for Eva. Eva here sells at flea markets. And so basically there's this whole trust graph that's expanding across the Bay Area of character-based lending. This is kind of how like Wells Fargo did it way back in the day, like 100 years ago. Like your banker would probably talk to your pastor and kind of ask, get to know you. But now it's all algorithmic, and those algorithms miss something. And so where there's gaps in the algorithmic credit scoring system, this is so complicated sometimes I think, but like it's so simple. Where your community believes in you, that counts. That's it. And that's one of the really cool things that I think we can do to bring down the cost of capital and make opportunity, more available. All right, so my wife said, oh yeah, this looks like conception. This is not a graph of conception. This is Kiva's scale, 2.8 million borrowers. Microcredit is 300 million people, and there's still 2.5 billion people left out today. And we know we're really small. But the key point that I wanted to say around equity and like really making an impact is that simply thinking about scale of impact, which a lot of people talk about, that's not the right question. The first question, I believe, is scope of impact and making sure that you're making the right impact and the depth is there. And then once it's there, then scale is really powerful. And I think sometimes, especially here in Silicon Valley, just number of lives touched, number of people on our platform, like it's tantamount to impact. And I think we just need to be much more critical of it. We certainly are. We're not happy with where we're at. We don't want to be complacent about it. We want to keep pushing at Kiva. And we want to engage others who are keen to kind of push on this thing. I think it's really important to be intentional about this stuff. All right, joy. Here it is. I just threw this word out because there's this beautiful poem. I don't know if any of you guys have seen it, but I saw it last month, and it really stuck with me, and I'll read it. It's by Rabindranath Tagore, Bengali poet, and he said, I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and saw that life was service. I acted, and behold, service was joy. And I think, I don't know where you all are in your own journeys on this stuff, but when I saw this, it's like a song on the radio that really hits you, that feels really true to you. And I was like, yeah, that's it. Like this, like what a great privilege, what a great joy. Even like when we find out our impact isn't as great as we thought it was, or, when we get, whatever, we have HR issue or something like that. Like it's it's not like perfect. But like there's such deep joy in doing this work. And I just hope as you guys are thinking about, how you want to channel your activism, for those of you who are at the start of your career, or those of you who are looking for ways to kind of sustain that activism. This one was really powerful for me, and it's something I wanted to share with you all. So with that, thanks for listening, and I'd love to engage in a conversation.
I think we have just time for maybe one or two questions, and then I'm guessing Premal I know you have some other engagements, so you might be able to answer one or two after if people want to come down, but we'll close formally at 5:30 so people can head out. So.
Great.
In the slide where you showed the impact sort of matrix, it looked like you had some pretty high interest rates on there.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, why do you always give out the loans yourself at zero interest? Why not take some cut of that to fund your own organization?
Great question. In order to actually drive impact. So funding our own organization helps with our own sustainability, but by actually being zero interest and all of us on the internet absorbing the losses, we're able to push these local partners to really try something at their risk and cost frontier. So I don't believe that Kiva simply sustaining itself and actually being big for big's sake is actually the path to impact. I think the better thing to do is actually be very surgical around our concessionary capital. That's like a better deal than everyone else, and then insist on proving the business case of lending, say, to refugees or trying something that they might not have tried. Now, it's not just a simple binary. There may be cases where, we could sliding scale on the price and we could look at that, but for now, just to keep it simple, we kept it at zero and try to be really precise around impact first. And then ideally we crowd in and prove the business case, and then the commercial capital comes in and they can price it, and it goes to scale and it's high impact, it's awesome. But that's the role of a nonprofit, is to not necessarily do what the for-profits would have done.
Yeah.
That's our thinking. Go ahead.
So earlier you alluded to closing the gap between donation and investment.
Yeah.
So when it comes to conducting due diligence, how much of a trade-off is there between the the business sense and kind of assuming a reduction in risk in a traditional way?
Yeah. So what we do is, how Morningstar has a mutual fund rating system? Oh, the question was, it was generally around risks and trade-offs in the due diligence process and what we see. And so we have 400 organizations that we work with around the planet. Each one gets a 1 to 5 star risk rating. If you have a 1-star risk rating, you can only raise $25,000 from the internet community before you have to start paying it all back. If you have 5-star, you can raise $2.5 million. And so you graduate each time each year that you're kind of paying things back, as well as each year as as our diligence of you shows that you're actually progressing and maturing as an institution. Like, you have a really proper board, you have audited financials now, you have a management information system. Essentially, as you strengthen as an institution, then you can raise more money from the platform. Does that make sense? And then a second kind of related question is, how are risk and impact aligned or inversely related? That's interesting. We do see some organizations where there's high repayment rate and there's strong evidence for great outcomes. So a real good example is Babagona in Nigeria. They work with farmers, doubling farmer yields, so basically doubling farmer incomes in like 24 months. They provide inputs and a bunch of trainings. Great organization. Kiva is the first outside funder. Now they scale to 30,000 clients in Nigeria, farmers in Nigeria. They have a 99% repayment rate, and they've done controlled trial on basically showing this kind of impact data. So there, it's a total. That's like there's that should be scaled, and that's fantastic. Sometimes what we find are things that have promising impact evidence, but it hasn't been de-risked in terms of scaling, in terms of like the financial viability, and that's where we want to play.
So great presentation, and I don't want this question at all to kind of ask questions about Kiva's model. I think it's really fantastic, the work you're doing, but I saw the Komaza example. I know Komaza, I think they're great, but since we're talking about sustainability, one concern about the Komaza model is they introduce an invasive species that has a significant water draw in a very arid area. And so how do you think about that trade-off between really important needs for communities with potential kind of longer-term environmental harm?
Yeah. The same thing could be true in the Nigerian example of doubling farmer yields. I mean, what are the inputs? How are they managed, right?
Yeah.
How do you take a systems view at all the different potentially unintended consequences of doubling yields or growing water-sucking trees like eucalyptus?
Our staff was really concerned about eucalyptus being an invasive species. Komaza, I don't know the specific details, but they said that they're introducing something called, I think it's Malia or something. It's like a local something. You might know more about forestry. And so our due diligence team felt comfortable with their plan. One of the things is if you load too many issues in the basket, you don't make progress. But of course, we don't want to do something that doesn't feel right. When it comes to Nigeria and doubling yields, there is something around if we could get more land intensification, right, and get more yield from the land. There's so much. I don't know the specific details there around the environmental impacts, but there is something around how much land would be needed for agriculture if we could actually get more yield from the land. But I'm sure there's also, you probably have a counterpoint to that. And we would love to be educated. That the truth is we're very much building the plane while we fly it, and we're trying to learn as much as possible to make more responsible decisions. So if you see something on the Kiva website, it's premal@kiva.org that you think is troubling, let us know and educate us so that we can make better decisions.
Yeah, it's iterative. It has to be.
It's very iterative. Yeah.
Well, let me formally close so that people who need to move on can, and then maybe Premal stay for a minute or two. But thank you all for coming. Thank you, Premal, so much for being here. Let's all join me in thanking Premal.
Thanks.